Hello and welcome again. In this last part of the presentation, I want to talk about the second Yugoslavia, that is about the state of Yugoslavia that was formed after the end of the Second World War, and the ways in which it attempted to address the same basic underlying factor of instability that undermined the kingdom of Yugoslavia. So why don't we begin by talking just a little bit about the Second World War and about some of the consequences of the Second World War for the kind of state that would be formed after it ended. Uh, if you look at this map here, you can see the ways in which territory was divided by the occupying forces in the Second World War. There is the coastal area and other portions of Kosovo and Macedonia and of Slovenia that came under Italian control. This Italian control existed until 1943, when Italy surrenders, and then control of this is transferred to mostly to Germany. There is a portion that is under occupation by Bulgaria, which was allied with the Axis forces in the Second World War. And there are some territories that are directly under German administration. These include in the north here a portion of Slovenia, and includes most of what was defined by the occupying authorities as the territory of Serbia, in which the Germans installed a puppet government led by General and former Defense Minister Milan Nedic, but it operated under military occupation. There was a portion, including parts of Vojvodina and parts of Croatia, that were occupied by Hungary, and then in Croatia, an area was established. It went by the name of the independent state of Croatia. This was formerly governed by a fascist movement, the Ustaše, under the leadership of Ante Pavelić. It was under German patronage. What's important here is that the territory of the independent state of Croatia also includes most of the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, including the capital, Sarajevo, some parts of Vojvodina, and this was a state, independent state of Croatia, that committed genocide. There was an intent, as a matter of policy, to remove from the territory all of the population of Serbs, of Jews, and of Roma. Serbia, under German administration, also had a genocidal policy, particularly directed toward the Muslim populations of the territory under the control. There were resistance movements in the Second World War, including one that was associated with the old Royal Yugoslavia, the Chetniks, and the Chetniks wanted to reestablish the royal state and were interested in the centralist Serbian project in this state. The Chetniks also had a genocidal project, mostly directed against the Muslim population, principally in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there was the resistance movement of the partisans, formed by the Communist Party, led by Josip Broz Tito. This was the movement that eventually gained the support of the Allies in the Second World War, that ended up establishing power, establishing a new state in Yugoslavia at the end of the Second World War, and this new state was one in which the dominant political power was held by the Communist Party. One point I would make about the Second World War is that there are only two territories where in the Second World War power was taken by a communist party because of the victory of a domestic partisan movement, that is, rather than because of an invasion by the Soviet Union. And those two territories are Yugoslavia and Albania. And one of the results of this was that when communist states were formed in Yugoslavia and Albania, they tended to have a lot more internal legitimacy and less resistance than in the other parts of Europe where communist states were formed. And they had international support, as you can see here by this photo on the right. of the major international film star at the time, Rita Hayworth, in a charity campaign to get support for what she calls in the poster the heroic people of Yugoslavia resisting occupation by Nazi Germany. Uh, so the partisans bring the Communist Party to power in Yugoslavia, headed by Josip Broz Tito. In the photo there, you can see Tito enjoying a drink with Queen Elizabeth. They establish a communist state. Now, let me make a quick note here, and that is this. When we talk about communist governments, I think it's important to do this without fetishism. Communist governments are not a kind of parallel reality in which the rules and patterns of politics do not apply. They are governments. They have projects, they are informed by what they know, they have successes, and they have failures. It's true that they're characterized by the dominance of a single party that holds political power, but this does not necessarily make them unique in the world. And what do the communists try to do when they come to power? First of all, they are conscious of the reasons for the failure of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and in particular, the failure of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia to resolve or to minimize tensions between the various national groups in the state. So their policy is directed in many ways toward national groups. The first thing that they do is they decide that some national groups are likely to be enemies of the state, and there is an effort to remove them. And this includes most of the ethnic German and most of the ethnic Italian populations in Yugoslavia. The second thing that they do is that they attempt to address opposition to a unified state on the part of different national and ethnic groups by mostly granting their demands, so that the state is divided up as a federation of republics, and each of the republics, except one, has a titular national majority. So Slovenia is the national state of Slovenians, Croatia of Croatians, Serbia of Serbians. They create a new one, Macedonia, for Macedonians. Bosnia and Herzegovina is seen as one that has three main groups that will exist through coexistence and cooperation with one another, this formula of brotherhood and unity, that is Serbs, Croats, and the group that eventually in communist Yugoslavia would come to be called the Bosnian Muslims, now referred to more commonly as Bosniaks. So they remove the populations that they think of as enemy populations, they grant national demands, and they impose a principle of national equality and of unity. Now, there is a basic contradiction within this resolution, and that is that on the one hand, the goal of this whole project is to suppress nationalism as a backward expression, but at the same time that nationalism is being expressed, it is also being affirmed through the creation of national territories. And these two principles are always in conflict with one another. And in particular, the idea of the unity of Yugoslav people and the idea that Yugoslavia is a federation involving several different national communities. The idea of equality is also not entirely clear, because there are national groups that have a national territory, the ones that are defined in republics, and there are ones that do not. Including the very large populations of Hungarians and Albanians, who have semi-autonomous territories, but which are not defined as national territories. The other big tension in the communist period in Yugoslavia was the tension between central as opposed to local control. And in the period after 1945, Tito begins by imposing strong central control. This inevitably leads to tension, and over time the state tends to decentralize. First with the political reforms of 1975, finally with the Constitution of 1974, which strongly limits the powers of the federal government, to management of the currency and of foreign relations and defense, and devolves all other powers onto the republics and autonomous provinces. Now, it's this period of 1974 that is important, because the 1974 Constitution, the one that very strongly decentralizes the state, was a response to both national demands for greater autonomy in the republics and autonomous provinces and demands for greater liberalization coming from the younger generation, coming from more democratically inclined portions of the Communist Party. Now, the 1974 Constitution responds to the demands for greater national autonomy in the republics. It does not respond to the demand for liberalization. It's in 1974 that Tito is declared president for life. At this time, he is already in his 80s. But what happens is, in absence of a strong central federal authority that can resolve disputes between the republics and autonomous provinces, this role basically devolves on a person, and Tito in the last decade of his life becomes the person with sufficient authority to settle disputes that the elites of different national territories are unable to settle on themselves. But Tito, being human, did not live forever. He finally died in 1980 at the age of 88, leaving no apparent successor. He was succeeded by a collective presidency of 8 members, one from each of the republics and one from each of the autonomous provinces, with a president of the presidency who would alternate in position every year. This was an institution that lacked central authority, and so there was no authority that had the ability to settle disputes that would emerge between the different republics and autonomous provinces. So the period between Tito's death in 1980 and the dissolution of the state in 1992 is one that is marked by tensions that continue to escalate, which institutions do not have the capacity to resolve. And we all know what happens next. Yugoslavia dissolves. It is divided into several independent states, each of them created on the basis of nationality and on the rule of a national majority. And then these new states are faced with the same problem that Yugoslavia faced as a unitary state from the beginning. That is, if you look at this map on the slide, what this map shows is the territory of the former Yugoslavia according to ethnic majority, that is, what group is in the majority in the population on the territory. And there are some parts of the state where the rule by majority is relatively unproblematic, except for some small areas with a Hungarian majority or with an ethnically Muslim, this is a unique Yugoslav term, majority. Serbia is mostly basically Serbian. Montenegro is basically mostly Montenegrin. Slovenia is basically mostly Slovenian. Macedonia, except for some areas with an Albanian majority, is mostly Macedonian. Kosovo is mostly, except for some areas with a Serbian majority, Albanian. But take a look at Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. There what you have is the kind of complex mixture with different areas with different majority, which make the creation of a state based on ethnic majority improbable and unlikely. So it is not a coincidence that when the state breaks up, this is where in the 1990s you see the outbreaks of the most intense violence based on competition of control of a majority and efforts to consolidate control of majority by changing the population. That is, by killing, by expelling, by intimidating members of the population in order to create majorities where there is no majority, and in order to expel minorities in places where minorities exist at a significant level. So the effort to create national states is faced with the same fundamental tension as the effort to create a unitary state based on this proposition that there exists a Yugoslav nationality, and this is at the source of tensions within these states that have been created still in the period, for most of them 20 years or more than 20 years after their establishment. Um, It is possibly because of this association of ethnic difference and competition for political control based on ethnic difference leading to violence that there is a tendency now, even in the period when Yugoslavia no longer exists, for there to nonetheless exists some level of nostalgia for Yugoslavia, and in particular for Yugoslavia during the communist period, as a state which was able to maintain a level of social peace without a significant degree of violence, to provide for a level of equality and security, to create feelings and sometimes the experience of openness and equality for its citizens. What I mean to say is that even in this period after Yugoslavia, there is still a meaningful level of nostalgia for Yugoslavia, and some members of the populations of these new states in the region who continue or begin to experience their own identities or to feel themselves as being more Yugoslav than members of a particular nationality. Part of this is based on genuine sentiment. Part of it is based on an uncritical approach to the period of communist control, although this was certainly not without its problems and not without its deficiencies of legitimacy. But possibly also when we talk about nostalgia, one thing that we may want to consider is that nostalgia is presented as being oriented toward the past, but it exists principally as a critique of the present. The reason that we look at the past is because there is something about the present with which we are not satisfied. And so we're going to explore this further in another session, but we might take this posture of Yugo-nostalgia, of nostalgia for the Yugoslav period and idealization of the Yugoslav period as not being so much about the idea of Yugoslavia, but possibly being about dissatisfaction with the kinds of states that were established once the Yugoslav project had failed. This is as much as I will present to you for this week, and I will look forward to discussing all of these ideas in more detail with you in our discussion section and when we have it on Monday.